context. When you and I first met, it was the 90s. And the 90s were characterized by ethnic warfare all over the world. Bosnia, Kosovo, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Rwanda, Hutus and Tutsis. And the 80s before them were characterized by the fear of nuclear, which is how I got started in this business. Then we had the 2000s. We had terrorism dominated 10 years of our lives. Then the 2010s, arguably, you had global warming really coming to the fore, and you had health and the COVID disaster. I think the 2020s, the 2030s are going to be characterized by two crucial things: information warfare and AI-generated information warfare and AI damage to our democracy. And when you think about the phrase in my field, what's a vital interest of a country, you say it's a vital interest if it can affect our way of life. And that's what Franklin Roosevelt said, that Hitler's Germany threatened our way of life. I think information warfare itself and hyper-information warfare through AI, artificial intelligence generated information warfare, is a threat to our way of life. And if it's going to be deployed by Russia, by China, and now increasingly by, this is a technology that can be scalable by small groups. In the same way the internet was used by terrorists, and suddenly they could organize and fund each other all over the world without the complications of physical reality. AI is a scalable tool for warfare for small groups, for terrorist groups, for small states. Obviously, for now, Russia and China are dominating it, but North Korea, Iran, potentially other countries and terrorist groups can take this technology that's so powerful if we're not careful and use it against us.
And then, so in my business, which is meant to be the truth and evidence and facts business, AI is a real danger. Because just as we had, in the 90s, it was the internet superhighway, that was that quaint term. And everybody went into their silos. When they started going to their silos, then we have social media, which doubled down on all of that and started really, hyping the fake news and really distributing it at warp speed. Now, obviously, AI can do that at even greater speed and create these viral moments that we don't even know what's happening, and we have no way to stop. I remember also, for instance, I had a panel on my program when Sam Altman and OpenAI came out, and I had some really interesting experts on, some of whom were really doomsayers. AI is going to doom us as a species, it's going to take over, not to mention jobs and all the other things people are concerned about. And others who said, no, let's wait and see. AI has unbelievable possible applications in medicine and science and other progress. And as I said before we started, it's been very useful on a daily basis when we do interviews as journalists. We shove it into a system, into an app, and we get our transcription in a minute or so, rather than in the hours it would take to physically transcribe, a 25-minute or a half-hour, an hour-long interview. So in those issues, it's really useful. But, as it becomes more and more sophisticated, and this is the thing that I can't get my head around, Jamie, this whole business of generative AI, which is apparently when this thing becomes more and more, if not entirely human-like in its cognitive abilities. And then we're screwed. I don't know how one has a defense against that and what it actually means.
Well, there's various levels. I mean, obviously at the fantasy level of movies, we had Terminator movies about an AI tool that became sentient and alive and decided to fight the humans by launching nuclear weapons, and that was the Terminator movie. I mean, I'm not someone who's too worried about that. I don't think any government would be stupid enough to hand up its nuclear weapons capability to a machine. I just don't believe that anybody's that stupid. The U.S. has begun to talk to China and Russia, not so much, but China more, about making sure they wouldn't do something so stupid. So that's one level. But the level that I'm worried about is what we talk about a lot, which is what is reality? You know, democracy can't work if we don't have an agreed reality. Democracy requires an agreed reality, so then we can debate what we want to do about that reality. If AI is used to undermine democracy by the authoritarian governments who want to undermine democracy, that's what Russia and China want to do. They do it every day. And in my last job in the State Department, I saw that happen. And I saw it at a level where AI was just starting, where they spent billions of dollars in creating alternative realities to affect democracies in Europe, the United States, and around the world. Now here's where your point comes in. Just take the issue of translations. The Russians and the Chinese used to have a position or a line, or an argument, or a claim, or a conspiracy theory they wanted to put. But it was requiring thousands of people to disseminate that information in all the languages of the world, hundreds of languages, and through the mechanisms. And remember the famous episode during the 2016 election where they hired these people in Macedonia. And Macedonians had, I don't know, 300-400 people in a place to disseminate these conspiracy theories. They don't need that anymore. Now the dissemination can be done by an AI tool immediately. The translation can be done immediately. And here's where the hard part comes. That with generative AI, they can automate the warfare itself. They can teach a tool to generate information warfare using the data that big data companies have given the world, where everyone knows everyone's opinions, or what they like, or what they don't like, and then they might go target. And that's what I'm worried about, the combination of all these hyper capabilities put together in an automated machine where you don't need humans to create these information warfare tools.
So, you raised a couple of issues that's also on the minds of those who are writing into us. How will AI impact facts and fact-checking? It goes to the heart of what we've just been discussing, because if you don't have empirical facts and evidence and truth, as I like to call it, where do you start? And I think that's a big, big issue, because even the social media titans who've been ordered to fact-check, as we've seen in the last month, certainly since the Trump administration, Trump 2.0, have actually pretty much decimated their fact-checking operations. So that's really, really dangerous for all of those who get their news from social media, not just their entertainment, but who believe news exists on social media. That's really, really dangerous. And then, Jamie, to you, Stephen asks,
Ma'am, burger tayo sa labas. Yung masarap. Burger sa labas, kanina sa loob. Pagbilang ng tatlo, magbaburger na tayo. Isa, dalawa, tatlo. Sino unang burger? 100% pure beef. Beefy sarap. Sino crispy burger? Burger beef.
what diplomatic strategies are being developed or should be to address everything, including cross-border AI threats like election interference, Stephen asked, and of course mindful that the State Department has essentially, again, denuded these particular tools and dismantled the tools that they have.
Right. Look, it's a painful reality for me to tell you that we worked really, really hard with these people that I managed at the Global Engagement Center to try to get a grip on this problem. And we had two kinds of things we were doing in this particular area. One was to have active defenses to interfere with what Russia or China were doing, to prevent them from succeeding in creating conspiracy theories in Africa or lying about truths and lying about realities in Asia. And we had these programs, and they were working. We were able to intercept Russian operations before they got started and succeed in killing them. And we were able to undermine Russian RT, the parent company, Rossiya Spodnia, which was using its tools all over the world in massive covert operations, and we put sanctions on it. Those capabilities in the State Department have been eliminated. we've talked about, RFE, Rated for Europe, Rated for Asia, Voice of America, all that is what you might call offense, what do we say? But the defense has been eliminated. The offense has been eviscerated by cutting the budgets. And what I worry about is that there were ideas out there to deal with things like deep fakes. Because remember, what AI can do is create this synthetic, fake reality through sound, through video, and through text. It used to be just text. Now it's all of those things put together to create fake narrative arcs that affect individual countries. And the machines are culturally sensitive. They know what works. So we were building an international system diplomatically where the Europeans, the Americans, the responsible countries in Asia, we're going to try to develop standards for making sure we knew when something was AI generated and when it wasn't. Sort of a watermarking system. And so that everyone would know this is AI, this is not AI. And that would begin to address the problem. All those capabilities were wiped out, and the funniest, sad, ironic part was Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, suddenly began to worry about deep fakes. And the people that were working on it, he had just fired. And so he couldn't get the help that he needed to prevent him from being deep-faked, which he ended up being, and the capabilities to work on this because of this right-wing conspiracy theory that all these people working on it were part of some censorship operation, which we weren't. We never worked in the United States. It had nothing to do with our work. But they fired all those people, and now our capability is limited. And we have to rely on large corporations like Elon Musk's corporation, like Facebook and Meta, who have eliminated the fact-checking, who don't seem to care about this at all. And that's why it's so worrying. Without government and big data and big companies who have these powers coordinating their action, and at least in this case, in the AI case of President Biden, the big AI companies agreed they needed to have some regulation. In your program, they admitted that when you had them on. Some of them did. But we can't have that if there's a total breakdown recognition that this is a problem. And that's what I'm worried.
And under a lot of pressure and hard work, a lot of
industrialized by using these great tools that we just described. So what happened in Romania was they created fake bots. Instead of having people at farms, they had bots at farms where they tens of thousands of bots suddenly created the grassroots movement in favor of this candidate Georgescu, and they brought him from zero to being the leading candidate in the first round of the election. The intelligence community of Romania figured out what the Russians were doing because they used TikTok and they used cyber, Bitcoin to pay people to actually manipulate. So it was a classic case of interference. And when the Romanians canceled that election because it was a poisoned chalice, as the Constitutional Court president declared, it became controversial. And because Georgescu was a right-winger, because he was saying things that the Trump team, and including Vice President Vance, liked, they challenged the cancellation of the election. Now, in the end, after a lot of incredible work, the people of Romania stood up and responded. But it caused a lot of controversy. Conspiracy theories will be discussed in Romania for decades. But in the end, the Romanian people refused to be manipulated by Russia, and it backfired because the correct information became available. Canceled, but didn't agree with how it was done because explanations weren't sufficient, which is a fair point. But again, we can't have these elections interfered with without damage, because the Russians had a plan. They wanted to turn Romania against NATO, and they almost succeeded.
It is remarkable because after that first presidential candidate and the process was exposed, then you said they did another runoff, another election, and there was another far-right populist candidate, and the same kind of interference happened on his behalf. But as you say, he didn't win, and the centrist mayor of Bucharest did win, fair and square. But as you mentioned, the US, I mean, and J.D. Vance, I was in Munich, it was at the Munich Security Conference, when he took that, well, and the example of the far right in Germany too, AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, and he basically said, by trying to expose the truth about them, he said Europe was being undemocratic. Imagine that. He lectured the European establishment at the Munich Security Conference and the voices of candidates who had been overtly and evidently pushed by Russia and this massive disinformation campaign. So that was a moment of real fear for everybody because they thought, oh my God, if the Americans are going to side with this, well, we've got no hope. And then, Jay, why do they do it? So why does Russia, China, and Iran do it? I mean, basically, and probably the other is they think they want to, well, they do want to get clients who are manipulative and for them, and they also want to really damage democracy. So that is another issue, right? This kind of interference and showing democracy or trying to show it in a really negative light. They're interested in actually chipping away at the value of democracy, not to mention in Ukraine, which is the point of this awful war by Russia.
Exactly. Look, this is the challenge for those of us fighting the Russian effort. It's not an accident that it's authoritarian countries that are doing this. Russia, China, they are authoritarian countries run by the Communist Party in China and by an individual, one man rule in Russia. They want to undermine democracy. And even if their candidates don't win, they get to undermine democracy by causing tension, by causing dissension, by causing anger.
Jolly mushroom sprouts. Sarap at sustansya na abot kaya. 20 pesos lang. Yan ang Jolly Love.
Anger, by eliminating the societal trust that is needed for democracies to be as successful as they should be. So, what happens here is they find every single issue, and this is where the AI part comes in. AI can help using big data to figure out what are all the points of tension in a society, the hundreds of issues that generate tension and dissension and anger among people. And then they use those tools against us by using AI to identify those areas, using it to disseminate conspiracy theories or messages in all the different languages instantly, and until democracies figure out a way to create what's called societal resilience, making sure a society is resilient against this interference in our way of life. The Russians and the Chinese, even if they don't win the particular election, can damage the democratic trust that's needed for us to succeed. Remember, democracies are more powerful when people believe in their leaders. Even if they didn't vote for them, they have to believe in them. They have to believe they're legitimate. That's why democracies in the end succeeded in World War II, because they were stronger in the end because they believed in their leaders. But if this trust is broken, if those who lost the election think the other side cheated, or those are, and the anger is created. Remember, after an election is supposed to be a moment when one side concedes and says, okay, we lost fair and square, and we'll fight next time. That's what used to happen in our countries.
Remember in 2000, Al Gore did in Egypt.
And he conceded, even though it was a pretty hard-run thing, it was a real question mark. Many people were angry at him. And he did the honorable thing. Where are these honorable politicians? Instead, we have people who just have their egos so wrapped up in these elections and their actions. They only care about themselves. And that selfishness is what the AI tools and the information warriors of Russia and China are playing on. All of that self-trust, which is essential for medicine and trends.
You have to mention clearly that January 6th was the apogee, if you like, of that kind. And then it happened in Brazil afterwards too. Bolsonaro tried to question the legitimate election of Lula, and there was a major standoff. And that has been a real turn-off for a lot of American voters, the idea of what happened and voters all over the place. And Russia must be licking its chops all over that. It points out something we have to internalize and be gaining ground every single minute. And just for my case, in India, they created an artificial news anchor, entirely AI generated, so they can impersonate any of us as well, and that's very, very scary. And as you say, I guess our companies have not yet come up with a way to make sure this doesn't happen and protect against that. So these are all things to talk about and think about. But shall we go into take a break again? And when we come back, I think we should pick up on what we discussed in the first part, and that is what happens when AI gets hold of the levers of war making and warfare, especially in the nuclear age. Whoops, phone's going, so we're going to take a break. All right, everybody, we're back, and we're going to talk about AI and warfare. But first, the challenge of who's going to stand up and counter this movement, because that is what it is. And again, a movement that the most fearful and the darkest thoughts are could actually overtake our independent human thought, not to mention our jobs and in the end our very existence. Sorry, but that's where it goes from the deepest naysayers.
Look, I'm someone who believes in our current world, despite all of its flaws and all of its difficulties and some of its mistakes, that when America doesn't lead a response to a new problem, that problem can't be fixed. The Europeans can't act as one. The Asian countries can't act as one. If the problem here is democracy, challenge democracy, and the technology is essentially beginning as primarily American-generated technology by American companies, the high-tech sector. What I am so pained by here is when J.D. Vance or the president himself denies the problem. Until the United States gets a grip on this problem as a government, and the United States as a society comes to grip on this problem, and the companies cooperate in solving this problem, it's not going to be solved flat out no. And that's why the denial by J.D. Vance of this problem that you mentioned that occurred at Munich that was so chilling, that he didn't get its act together, and America has to help the world get its act together, because this is really, really hard. This is not
right now, the world is trying to help and prompt America because, as you said rightly, there is no regulation. Neither the owners, they give sort of lip service when they're holding before Congress and this and that. But at least in Europe, they have passed, significant rules, regulations over this stuff. Maybe it's not enough yet, but it's happening, and they've got to keep doing it. So, Jamie, when it comes to the most dangerous of human endeavors, that's warfare. The human factor has to be involved. Otherwise, you just have Star Wars or video games, war games, and the right. So I was really fascinated after the 12-day war. It's not a war. A 12-day strike on Iran by Israel and missiles. There was a lot of AI going on. There was a lot of fake, so-called ordinary civilian testimony, especially in Israel, because they're good at this stuff too. And
well, if they're creating tools that are killing democracy, denying That's not something they should out. But yeah, fair, as you're describing, where people claim things happen that didn't happen. And remember, the Iranians are pretty good at it too, and they do some of this as well. But in the end, I just have to, since I know that even when the Chinese-U.S. relationship was as bad as it was under Biden, it was very bad for a while there, really in the first year and a half, took a while to stabilize. On this subject, at least, it was eyes to sort of clear when it came talking about it, where AI interferes with these conventional wars, which now, remember, are drone-generated wars where drones are doing the killing, and machines are aiming those drones, which are those drones. And if you get that all wrong, you can really make some terrible mistakes in the future.
Exactly, but look, let's focus a little bit because, as you said, you got your start in public service because of the terror and fear, particularly under the Reagan administration, of some kind of nuclear war. And many of us as students, we read all the horror stories around it. We marched against nuclear war. We really were pretty scared about the whole thing. It hasn't happened yet, thank God, but there's been some near misses. I was again talking to. And all of that, those franchises, Alien, who's about to do another big issue, and it's about nuclear war, and it's going to be about Hiroshima, which earlier this month marked the 80th anniversary since the US dropped two nuclear bombs, one on Hiroshima and one on Nagasaki. So what he said to me, and I think it's interesting, is that the narrative counts. People have forgotten what actually it looks like. Remember, Jamie, in the 80s, there was a TV film called, was it called The Day After? Something like that.
Exactly, the day after.
Yeah, and it
And you
showed...
remember in the country that Ronald Reagan, the president, insisted that ABC News give television time to Secretary of State George Shultz to come on TV after the program to tell the American people, no, this didn't happen. This isn't real. This isn't going to happen. Calm down. That's how palpable the feeling is.
Which is incredible, but that shows what we're lacking right now, and that is storytelling, whether it's filmmaking or reportage or whatever it is, that focuses people's attention on what's ahead. So he said, yeah, I did. The Terminator did that, and I'm glad that we put it out there because it did have an effect. I'd forgotten about George Shultz. I don't even know whether I was in the US at the time. Maybe I was, but
I think you were based on the time, because I remember it was like 1983.
Like 83 or something.
Yeah, 82,
Yeah.
83.
Yeah. And I guess I'd just gone from college to CNN at the in 83. So that's really important. And then also in this interview was Ernest Moniz, who you also know, Jamie, the former Secretary of Energy for the US, himself a nuclear physicist, and he was also instrumental in the very technical parts of the negotiations between the US and Iran over the nuclear deal, the JCPOA back in 2015, which then Trump pulled out of. And I asked him, I said, what about AI and the military, and particularly of nuclear warfare? He said, well, look, as you just said, the presumption and the declaration has been that there will always be the human factor. There will always be a human in the... That doesn't actually be a fail-safe, a fail-proof system. What if mistakes are made? And he said in the era of AI, the decision-making process is so contracted. The decisions that used to make you have
mistake in the system where they thought their attack was coming, and they had to, in Russia, that's not to do. It's a hero, a real hero, saved, arguably humanity. There was a similar case in the indicators that these attacks were coming. You're absolutely right. With AI, those indicators can be that much more real, that much more persuasive, using some spoof to try to convince Russia to attack each other. jail or sent to prison, even if you know something is wrong. And the more authoritarian it is, the more it is. If you don't, someday, I really do worry that happens. But for now, that's not the trick created an Orwellian world where they can watch by democratic.
Mind you that you're going to have rich millionaire Austria coalition coming after you.
I didn't.
Just the democratic process.
In the United States. Remember, rebuild, as you say, Marshall Plan was one of the great programs that created thriving democracies in the ashes of totalitarian warlike systems of the Japanese invading the world and Hitler's Germany. Democracy.
10 years ago episode, you can always listen to Christian Ampur Presents Stars with Jamie Rubin, Global Player. You can download from the App Store or go to Stars with Jamie Rubin, Global Player. You can download from the App Store or go to globalplayer.com or wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can always view it when it drops on YouTube. Okay, bye.
Bye.
And welcome, Alan Paul. Given that you are now joining the global family, I suspect we will bump into each other rather more often than previously. I begin, I think, with questionably everybody who bumps into you must ask. Imminently, co-presenter of Christiane Amanpour Presents The X-Files with Jamie Rubin, of which more later. But you're best known, for which more later. But you're best known for your coverage of Frontline, your war reporting. I imagine everybody that you bump into at the moment wants to talk to you about America and the Middle East, but not necessarily in that order.
Not necessarily in that order, but America, because under Trump and in Trump's hands, it's become a completely different object, a completely different center of power. And honestly, we're still waiting to see where all the pieces. We know from the first term what it's going to be like, but it's completely and utterly different. The speed with which President Trump has essentially pushed the limits of executive power and kept pushing and testing to see how far the system will allow him to expand his personal power, all the while saying that any president should have this prerogative, despite what it says in the Constitution, and etc. That is entirely new, and the speed with which it's happening and the sort of multiple levels on which it's happening, whether it's the Doge, the Elon Musk outfit, which is cutting and slashing through all aspects of government and even America's soft power in foreign policy, whether it's education and the First Amendment, whether it's in mass deportations, and clearly the overseas massive problems, which are the wars, Israel, Palestine, Russia, Ukraine, and then, of course, the trade war. So can you imagine all this happening at the same time?
Right, I don't have to, but I can't see
where to kind of use your sieve and try to figure out what's important, what's not. In my opinion, it's all important if you hold on. Rethink its historic destiny and its project, and it's decided to change how it views the world and its role in the world. And it's not gradual, it's all of a sudden.
Have you been surprised?
Yes, and I think everybody's been surprised. I'm not surprised by the it, which is what he telegraphed during the campaign. He said a lot of things. I will be your retribution. I will this. I will that. I will cut $1 trillion. I'll get Elon Musk. I'll get all these things. I'll stop wars within the first 24 hours. That hasn't happened. But I'm surprised that a lot of it, he said the same thing about deportations and this, but that it's all happened so quickly and that it's all executive orders. There's almost no actual legislation. And that, I think, frightens people because it looks like it's essentially his master's voice. It's what the powerful, the executive is throwing down the gauntlet, challenging us all to say, at what point will you stop? At what point will you, the courts, exercise your constitutional authority? To what point will you, media owners, exercise your constitutional privilege under the First Amendment? Not just us as journalists who have this, God-given freedom of speech and of expression, but I believe our owners have a responsibility to protect that as well. And of course, many of them are now not publishers, are they? They're business people.
Yeah.
And many of them have deals with the government, and therefore many of them are, in positions to be pressured. So it's very, very difficult. And then of course on the immigration, which we've all watched.
How are they doing, the media owners, or indeed the media? Because it's not just the owners, it's editors. How
I think if you take you take the executive suite,
Sure.
and do one thing, and you take the editors, producers, journalists, presenters, camera people, digital writers. I genuinely think good journalism and very good journalism is being sent out of the United States right now. I think they are rising to the occasion. I think the journalism is very good. And from interesting places, there are two big family-owned operations in the US, which are News Corp, obviously owned by Rupert Murdoch, and the Wall Street Journal is doing a heck of a job in terms of really, because it's strength is business, obviously. So it sees what Trump is doing on business, and it has its own economic views. And to be fair, it's had many interviews with him in the campaigns and now, and they are completely against tariffs, and they've argued this with him in the run-up. And so, and they're doing a lot of work. They're really digging hard, not just into the economic part, but that as well. I think the New York Times is doing incredibly well. Again, a family-owned organization, which is a real legacy media, but a phenomenal journalistic operation, including online with its streaming and the daily and all the rest of it. And then, I obviously am going to say that CNN continues to do excellent work covering the world. But it's hard. Yeah. It's hard. It's very hard. Partly because of where owners stand, and partly because everybody's worried about the financial, fallout. If Donald Trump is saying this, that, and the other, and all these media owners see their stock prices crashing and this and that, well, they're going to hunker down, which means that potentially it's going to be more difficult to go out to the Ukraines and the Middle East and the Chinas and all the rest of it.
That's the closest I've heard in a while to an overview that has a thesis at the heart of it. Just a bit about Trump pushing the parameters of what he can get away with and waiting, because it's one of the only theories that unites all of the potentially restricted forces, all of the engines or the institutions that can push back against the executive overreach, whether it is other politicians or whether it's the judiciary or whether it's the media. But you make it sound like a master plan rather than just the sort of mad ravings of a...
No, I don't think it's the mad ravings. I think it is a master plan.
Is it his master?
I think it's his and his enablers.
Right.
I think that if you look at Project 2025, everybody's said we were conspiracy theorists and that it's just a working document that Trump himself denied it.
Yeah.
Like Peter denying Jesus, right? It's not, right? I don't recognize this. Yes, it's happened. Exactly. But it is almost chapter and verse, including the inordinate amount of executive orders so fast, and the whole idea of, flooding the zone, which was one of the first terms, and I mean, that's months ago, we've forgotten that already, throwing spaghetti at the wall, expanding the parameters, and that's what they're doing, and I think they're also now very, in a targeted way, for instance, on the deportation, in this case wrongful, which they admit was wrongful and a mistake, of this Salvadoran man who lives in Maryland. I always get the combination of his name wrong, but Garcia, essentially, sent to a gulag, which the Trump administration is paying El Salvador, who calls himself a cruel dictator, but there's nothing cool about that gulag, and they don't want to bring him back, even though the Supreme Court has said. And I believe, I can't tell you this for sure, but I think it's because they want to make an example. They want to say, if we can do this here, don't any of you try. They want to make examples of various things. Look at the crackdown on the academic higher education institutions, from Harvard to Columbia. Some are standing up,
and some are not.
And that's a problem.
To what end, Christian? What, I mean, if it's a plan, if it's a roadmap, what's the destination?
Well, the destination, I think, is to change the culture. I mean, I think that the only way that I can understand America, being that I'm not American, nor do I cover inside America. In fact, I've been wrong. I was wrong about who's going to win the election several times. But I do believe it's a struggle for the soul of America. I heard somebody say that, and I think it's true. Or the mind of America, or whatever it is, it's a struggle to define what it means to be an American in 2025 and trace it all the way back, if you want, to the beginning of the 20th century, but all the way back to the founding of the Republic, and even before, you know, with the Native Americans and what happened with them, and then the slavery and this and that. All these massive issues, massive historic issues that have never been so much as addressed, much less resolved. And I think that there is a big competition between those people who believe that the Constitution gives them maximalist power, or they don't care what the Constitution says, and those who believe in the written word of the Constitution and believe in human rights, believe in diversity, DEI, a crappy acronym, I'll give it to you,
Sure.
but what does it mean? It means leveling the playing field. I'm a woman, I'm caught up in that, you know, black people, people of color, people of different, you know, sexual preferences and etc. This is all about trying to build an inclusive nation. But for many, it has just been gone too far. And then this other awful word, woke, has caused essentially this culture war, or stirred a culture war that's always existed in the United States. And these guys are hammering back.
The perception that society has tried too hard to accommodate difference.
Yes,
And
I think so. And try too hard,
Which it hasn't.
which I don't think it has, but maybe people think that the whole debate over toilets, the whole debate over pronouns, the whole debate over words, how you describe things, that's just, they think, a level of burden that they don't want to deal with. They can't see that it's because for centuries, not just in the United States, but all over the world, you know, minorities have not had a fair and just shake. And the world, we know this from every single, just take the economic data from the IMF or the World Bank or whatever you believe in. They'll tell you that diversity in any endeavor, any human endeavor, from business to government to whatever it is, increases the pool and increases the pot of prosperity for everybody.
Giga, movement that inspires.
You know, the woke thing and the trans thing, which you just raised, it was a gift to Donald Trump's enablers, the whole transgender conversation, because it is more complicated and more nuanced than all of the other isms, the racism, the sexism, much more. And yet, if you ask people to define woke or to give you egregious examples of wokeism, they can't do anything but mention the things you've just mentioned, the pronouns, the toilets.
Exactly.
So there is no woke. There is just this attempt to pretend that the perceived overreach on transit.
Some people are just
also applies to-
offended,
yeah.
exactly. Some people are just offended that they don't get the right to rule the world.
Bingo. And that is why I wonder when I asked what the destination was. When do these men, and it is mostly men, when do they sit back and say mission accomplished?
It's a good question. You know, but it is, I think we have to be very conscious that this is a clever, thought out plan. Whether it is the Federalist Society that for decades worked to promote the elevation of conservative judges and found in Trump somebody who didn't have their religious views necessarily or even their political views, but was somebody who turned for their support, Christian evangelicals, all those people in that domain, in that community, promised them, it's typical politics, right? But this was politics with a cultural mission. So look at the Supreme Court, 6-3. It's going to be 6-3 forever. It's not balanced. And I'm not saying it should be 6-3 the other way, but it's not balanced. And that has brought, taken away rights from women, taken away civil rights, threatening voting rights, all sorts of stuff.
And it never ends. I mean, until what? Until he has the same sort of power as the Saudi king that he's currently paying court to.
It's hard to tell.
Well, it is, isn't it?
Well,
but have you stopped? Have you managed to shed your normalcy bias? Have you started to think?
It's not. I don't think it's normal at all.
No, what I mean is, we will return to normality. This will only be an aberration. There's no way it couldn't happen here. We're back to Upton Sinclair.
Yes.
All of it could.
Yes. I will say that I used to be like that.
Yeah.
Certainly in the first term. And we sort of few people will say, wow, okay, the world survived that. Because there were a lot of aberrations there, but nothing compared to right now. I do think from everything I've been reading and everything that I've experienced from traveling around the world and living in these kinds of societies and reporting on these societies, whether you have the strong man in whatever form or fashion, an elected dictator for life, essentially, right? It's very, very difficult to turn back the clock, even after only a few years. And I read this recently and interviewed about it, just with regards to Poland, in Europe. They had for a long time, I can't remember whether it was 8 or 12 years or whatever, but they had a very, very conservative government. And then the last election, they elected more centrist, more liberal government. And in areas that the Conservatives had worked so hard, which are the areas of the judiciary, you have to really go for the judiciary, in areas of the press, in areas, that would underpin any kind of society, they had changed it so fundamentally that it is difficult to roll it back. They're trying in various areas because actually it was outside the norms of what the EU rules are for membership. So for that reason alone, if no other reason, the Polish, authorities are trying to reverse some of that excess. But that excess exists in Hungary. There's a trend. Trump is actually, helping some, but not helping others. There's also a reverse trend in Australia, in Canada, in other places. So again, I genuinely think it's a battle for the nature of who we are as people and as democracies. And I think it's on both sides the battle is being fought.
And all of the administrations and individuals on what we'll call the other side, they all bend the knee to Moscow.
Do you mean the Hungaries and all the rest of it? A lot of them do. Yeah, for whatever reason. Part of it is historic, part of it is conspiracy. Why should we,
shared interest and just simple things like instability.
Simple things, even cheap oil.
Yeah.
Things like that in this day and age. It's a shame because when you can't get people who call themselves democracies, who live by European rules, who believe in the rule of law, and that the fundamental rule is thou shalt not invade thy neighbor. There's only one answer to that, and yet some in Europe are unable to see that Russia is wrong here. Russia's the aggressor and should be confronted.
Has all of this ever felt in the course of your career as global and interlinked? So when you're in Bosnia or when you're in Ukraine the first time around or when you're in the Gulf War, they felt to outsiders, to consumers of news, they felt like self-contained events. Now it feels like everything is, if not linked, then at least related.
I think there's truth to what you're saying. I would say also that in those years when I was first active as a foreign correspondent, it was the immediate post-Cold War years. So we really had what President George H.W. Bush called a New World Order. And again, that was another thing that everybody had to reckon with. But it seemed, as they say, the arc of justice, the arc of history bending towards justice and freedom and economic prosperity and more equality and this and that, and more information, not just your state-run propaganda, but access to travel and to seeing things with your own eyes that you maybe only heard about on the BBC World Service or Voice of America, which, by the way, now they're threatening in the United States. These are very important pieces of soft power. So I would say when I first started, you felt that you were entering actually an interesting, new and positive world order. And I guess what I wasn't prepared for and didn't see coming was the backlash. The backlash has been huge and knock you over the head with a hammer. And, you've had years in the 90s of peace and prosperity, plus real problems. The wonder,
Well, that's what I mean by being isolated incidents rather than part of the global tide and trend.
Yes. And I think now it's much more...
Back to global trends and tides.
Yes, but at the same time, another way people are trying to decipher Trump is it about spheres of influence? Yeah. Is this where we're going to end up with? I was just speaking to a friend of mine who's very, very plugged in at the UN, who has perfect pedigree at the United Nations. This year, I believe in September, is the 80th anniversary, right? And there are real doubts about whether the United Nations can survive, at least in this current format. And what will that mean? And at the same time, people are, and funding is at a critical level. I mean, they're out of funding. Some countries haven't paid their dues, maybe they will, but they're very, very bad right now. Some people believe that Donald Trump is one of these, late 19th century spheres of influence, early 20th century spheres of influence kind of guys, and that he is happy to let, eventually, once he's topped them over the head of it, Xi take Asia Pacific, Putin take what we might as well call Eurasia, if Putin takes it, Europe, Asia, Russia, etc. Not sure what happens to, Southeast Asia, India, and etc. And the United States takes the West and hunkers down behind all the West. This West doesn't necessarily include Europe. And that, I think, is scary. I do. Because whatever the problems with Europe, and of course we in the UK know that there was a whole referendum fought on this, it is still a project that was designed to guarantee peace on a continent that has 500 million inhabitants, that is a huge voting bloc, that has so much power and ability, and to crash Europe again, I think would be very, very problematic.
Driving an all-new Nissan Patrol is an extraordinary experience.
How do you work through the obvious tension between all of this being professionally absolutely fascinating and yet personally? And I know you've also spoken about how becoming a mother changed the way you looked at a lot of your professional interests. But so professionally brilliant, fascinating, great for business. Personally terrifying.
I'm not sure whether it's great for business this time around.
Okay, go on.
Well, I'm noticing that ratings in the United States are not what they were in the 2016-2020 cycle of Trump. They're not. And partly is because people are tired and scared and feel sort of a bit depressed and dark. Partly because of the increasing fragmentation of the media landscape and of the podcast business and the alternate media, essentially. So I think that I'm not terribly sure that it's good for business at the moment.
Not in a commercial sense, but in the sense of you getting your intellectual teeth into something and deriving enormous satisfaction from that. It's great.
In that regard, yes. I'm not sure about satisfaction, but because it's quite scary. But I am really, as a curious reporter, interested to see where this all falls down. And the first major marker, James, will be in a couple of years during the midterms. That's the first major marker. If things don't change, President Trump's ratings are very, they're not in the toilet, but they're not where he would want them to be at this time in his presidency. And I think that's something that they're saying, hang on, we didn't sign for all of this. And I'm not saying his base, because MAGA are true believers, but I'm talking about the people who gathered outside MAGA to bring him over the top, because you can't just win with MAGA or just Republicans. You have to have the independents, you have to have the disaffected Democrats, all of that kind of stuff. So, and the other coalition, Obama coalition, who decided to defect. So I think that, the whole silly slogan about you don't need 250 pencils, how about 5 pencils, you don't need $30, what about $3? It's frightening people because they're saying, hang on, is it Scrooge? Is our Christmas and Thanksgiving going to be ruined? But more than that, are are we going to be poorer? Are we going to be worse off? We voted for him to make us better off. So that's his challenge, like any president. Is that, it's true, it's truism, huh? It's the economy, stupid. It genuinely is.
And it doesn't matter to the base that he might accept a $400 million aeroplane from the Emir of Qatar, that even as he's telling them that they won't be able to buy their children dolls.
Yes, I think he's framing it in, it's for the presidency, it's for the good of the country, all the rest of it. But he did actually ask a direct question, answer a direct question, and he said, what are you, fake news, asking me that question? That's a stupid question, I'm paraphrasing, I don't have the exact answer. But he said, in golf terms, if you're given the putt, you take the putt and run with it.
Yeah.
That's his answer.
So there's no sort of question of a moral dimension or
Are you surprised?
precedent in that. Not remotely surprised by it, but I'm always surprised by the people you referred to at the beginning of this segment, the ones who still seem to subscribe to the idea that you don't need to worry about what he says, only about what he does, and how much does he have to do before you start acknowledging that he does what he says.
Exactly.
He's going to do. It's been extraordinary.
I would say, there are some who have fought back, as we've said, some of the academic institutions. I think the press is doing a pretty good job under these circumstances. But also, the senator who got out and went. It was his constituent. This is not a vanity project. It's not for scoring points. It's not performative. That was his duty. Senator Van Hollen got up and went and insisted on getting access to his constituent. He's a senator from Maryland, and Garcia was his, Abrego was his constituent. And then, of course, the guy who calls himself a coolest dictator, Bukele in El Salvador, created this, as you remember, this photo opportunity with margaritas and umbrella drinks. And they see, they're just fine. Of course, this was all a photo op. But it looks like Van Hollen at least got him out of that place. Now they've got to figure out how to get him back to the United States.
When you were in your sort of in your pomp on foreign partnerships, and the phrase that I always remember of yours is the idea that journalists should be truthful, not neutral.
Yeah.
Which is true in places like Rwanda and Bosnia in times of genocide.
Yes.
It's true in states now, isn't it?
I think it is. I think you can apply that almost to everything. Not everything, because it's usually on big matters of state or international humanitarian law or those kinds of violations, where there is no equating, victim and aggressor, etc. But I do believe that even in climate discussions, you cannot do this both siderism, because it's not true, it's not truthful. It might be neutral, but it's not objective. It's not even impartial. It's actually a lie. And I learned that in Bosnia, when you try to equate the people, and we're talking, elderly men who are not frontline soldiers, women and children, who were in front of our eyes being sniped to death, shelled, and otherwise besieged and starved by the enemy, the Bosnian Serbs in the hill, for years. Everybody, the rest of the world, the leaders at the time didn't want to do anything about it, didn't want to intervene. So accused us all of going, over the other side, or in those horrible days, she's lost her objectivity, or even worse, And I had to really think about what objectivity meant in these extraordinarily stressful conditions and moments. And I just said, if you're not willing to be truthful, then you're an accomplice to the worst kinds of atrocity. And I'm not willing to be an accomplice, so I'm going to call it like it is. And that's what I've done with my career the whole time. And I'm pleased, because it gives me clarity, and it doesn't make me wobble, which is not to say there are not many difficult issues that you have to really grapple with. But it gives me clarity, and I think in the United States you can use that a lot as well.
But there were also, of course, accusations of a loss of objectivity when you married Jamie.
You mean Cristiano Moore presents the X-File with Jamie Rubin?
that guy, because people wondered whether or not, given his role at the time, he would be Assistant Secretary of State for Public Affairs under President Bill Clinton, and a key US foreign policy spokesperson, whether he was possibly pushing things in your direction.
Well, you are right, James. There was a bit of a controversy at the beginning, and we proved that it didn't have to be a problem, that because his job was actually to be forward-leaning towards journalists, he knew how to speak to journalists, and on matters that he wouldn't discuss with me, he just told told me what he would tell the New York Times. Interestingly, the New York Times came down. Actually, it could have been. I think they said it's not improper, something like that. So I think that was pretty good as well. Because in those days, once the New York Times gave you a blessing, you were pretty much home free. And in my youthful arrogance, shall we say, I thought, hang on, I'm the one who's telling them things. I'm in the field. I'm in Bosnia and Rwanda and all those places.
They can't get access.
Yeah, they just look at my reports every day, of course. I mean, that was a little bit over arrogant, but nonetheless, that's how I felt about it. I didn't feel the need to and also it would have been wrong, and it would have been uncomfortable, and it would have been stressful, and it just wouldn't have been good on a personal level to try and pull those things out of him. But I think that it would never have been allowed today. In our in-judgment era, in our social media era, everybody and their brother would have some view
They would
about
have just thrown so much
at it
that it would have broken.
Yes.
It would have been unsustainable.
possibly for our leaders, not for me, because I don't pay attention, I don't get broken.
No, but sorry guys, I know there's nothing going on here, but it's about the perception of wrongdoing and the amount of, a bit like Macron having to establish this morning that he wasn't taking cocaine on a train with Keir Starmer and...
I mean, that's just so ridiculous.
But it wouldn't
I
have
never believe it.
in a previous universe,
Yeah.
that level of misinformation and propaganda.
Disinformation and propaganda.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I will tell you that, Jamie had an exceptional boss in Madeleine Albright who fully trusted him. She was an exceptional foreign policy stateswoman, diplomat, and human being. And I had an exceptional boss. The head of CNN was exceptional. And he trusted me. Tom Johnson was a brilliant ally, and he trusted me. And by the way, he had been in the Johnson White House, Lyndon B. Johnson White House. So he had seen, what it's like. He'd seen relationships in the White House. I want to say Doris Kearns Goodwin, or Doris Kearns, and her husband, Goodwin, who they both worked in the Johnson White House. But there were historic past, precedents, and here we are. But I think now it would have been too much for the social media world.
Yeah, I agree. That's really
cope with.
interesting. I just for the benefit of people listening, one of the reasons why this episode of Full Disclosure sounds a little bit different to previous ones, if you didn't know, is because Christiane has been here before, and we covered the journey from Ealing in West London via Tehran and the journey that he took into becoming a journalist and the various stops along the way. So that's already in the
archive.
In the archive, on the record. We didn't get on to how, as a direct consequence of your relationship with Jamie Rubin, how becoming a mother profoundly changed the way you thought about your work. I think you described it as giving your life meaning beyond journalism. I
think that's absolutely true, and it remains true. My son is now, our son is 25 years old, and we are incredibly proud of him. And he is a really exceptional, compassionate, smart, young man, who wants to do the right thing, wants to, does a little journalism, is really mostly into film, he wants to be a writer, director, he knows it's difficult. But you know what, he's doing something which is a beautiful story. I took him when he was 17, it was his half term. I took him on a work trip of mine to Jordan, and it was the Syrian refugees in camps in Jordan, refugees from the war there. And he met a young Syrian refugee, because I was interviewing the family. They were exactly the same age. Mohammed from Syria, who lost his father and became the head of the family with his siblings, and essentially was expected to look after his mother and the rest of the family at 16 in a refugee camp in Jordan. And my Darius, 16, nearly 17, with a completely different, life expectation in terms of what he would be able to do, and, the freedoms he had, and he bonded so closely with this young man his own age, and they stayed in touch. And now he is going to tell the story of this coming of age between the two of them, mostly because young Mohammed wants to take his family back to Syria now that Bashar al-Assad is fallen, and go back and find the land that his father had to, his father's land that they had to leave. There was a house that's being constructed, and a whole new life. I just think it's brilliant. It's just so beautiful. I'm so proud.
And of course, as a traditional foreign correspondent, that would have been off limits, that sort of personal relationship and that sort of allowing your empathy to define?
Yes, but no. You know, I think empathy is a very underrated quality.
Sure.
And I do believe that you cannot be a successful correspondent, but especially a people-facing correspondent, when you go into the worst, most difficult places in the world and watch people suffering so much, you cannot be completely and utterly like a block of ice.
Do some of your cohort try to be?
I think things have changed. I think since I started, that rule has changed a bit. Sometimes over the top. People over-emote, people over-perform. But I think in general, we are a group of people who go there because we believe in championing the underdog as well as telling the truth. And we believe still that the power of our medium gives our voice amplitude and on behalf of people who don't have a voice. And that's I'm going to say my defining mission. I know many of my colleagues feel that way. Otherwise we wouldn't do it, It's not just for the kids.
But it was becoming a mother that changed the world.
But it just made me more, scared. I didn't want to lose my life in a battlefield, And it made me, yes, more empathetic, but more visibly emotional and empathetic, because I couldn't stop myself reacting when I saw kids in deep distress when I had a kid at home.
I think that's really interesting.